The snow had already come when she arrived, which meant the past would close behind her inside of a week. She had known that before she left. She had known it the way she knew most things, quietly, without making a production of it, and without expecting it to change anything. The man who met her at the stage stop was not what she had imagined, though she could not have said exactly what she had imagined. He was tall in the way that country makes men tall, not through any particular pride, but through years of looking at distances. He had a good jaw and bad posture, which told her something. He held his hat in his hands and turned it twice before he said her name, and then said it wrong, and she corrected him without embarrassment, which seemed to unsettle him further. His name was written in the letter she had folded into her coat pocket 3 months ago in Missouri. She did not take the letter out. She had memorized the relevant parts. He said, "The wagon's around back." She said, "All right." Neither of them said anything else for a while. The ranch sat 11 miles from town, northeast, along a creek that had no name on any map she'd seen. He told her the name locals used for it, something with a hard consonant in the middle, and she repeated it once to fix it in her mind. The ride took the better part of 2 hours. He drove. She sat beside him and watched the land. It was the kind of country that took some people badly. She had heard that about Montana before she came, that it either grabbed hold of you or it didn't, and there wasn't much in between. She watched the ridgeline and the way the light came off the snow and didn't make any immediate conclusions. She preferred to let a place show her what it was before she decided what to think about it. He said, once, "It's not much to look at this time of year." She said, "Most things aren't." He glanced at her, and she looked ahead at the horses. The road wound up a long slope and then down again, and when the buildings came into view, she cataloged them before she spoke. A main house, 2 stories, 1 window boarded. A barn that had recently lost part of its roof to something, weather or weight, hard to say which. A smaller outbuilding she couldn't immediately identify. A fence line that ran straight for 100 yards and then stopped without explanation. She said, "How long has the hay barn roof been like that?" He said, "Since October." She said, "What are you wintering?" He said, 40 head, give or take." She did the math without mentioning it. The inside of the house was cold in the way of houses that have been heated inconsistently. Some rooms held warmth and some didn't, and you could tell by the door frames which ones had been used and which hadn't. She walked through the kitchen first, which was the room that mattered most, and stood for a moment with her hand near the stove without touching it. The fire had been let down to coals. She didn't say anything about that. The kitchen had a good window, south-facing, which meant light in the morning and again in the afternoon. The table was solid, scarred, the kind that had been worked on. There was a set of shelves with gaps where things had been taken down and not replaced. She counted what was there: flour, some salt, a tin of something without a label, beans that looked like they'd been there since the previous winter. She said, "Are the beans from this year?" He said, "I think so." She said, "You'll want to check before you cook them." He looked at her the way people looked when they weren't sure if they were being criticized. She wasn't criticizing. She was just telling him something useful. He said, "I wasn't sure what I thought I'd let you settle in before we talked about arrangements." She said, "What arrangements need deciding?" He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I suppose we should talk about what you're here for, what the situation is." She said, "I read your letter." He said, "There may be things the letter didn't cover." She said, "There usually are. We can talk while I look at the rest of the house." The bedroom situation was what she had expected. The house had 3 rooms upstairs and 1 downstairs that someone had been using as a kind of office, papers on the floor, a coat on the back of a chair. She didn't ask whose room was whose. She took the smallest of the upstairs rooms, the one over the kitchen, which would be warmer than the others on account of the stovepipe below. She set her bag on the floor and looked out the window. From here, she could see the barn, the broken section of roof, and part of the fence that stopped. She could see the slope behind the property where the tree line came down close to the pasture. She could see, if she stood to the left and pressed close to the glass, the corner of what she now understood to be a root cellar built into the hillside. She could see something else too. A small stone arrangement on the far side of the fence, set apart from the rest of the yard, in the way that things are set apart when they are meant to be separate from daily life. She filed that away and went back downstairs. His name was not something she used much that first week. They had not yet arrived at the easy habit of it. She called him nothing, mostly, and he seemed to understand that this was not hostility. It was just the way things were until they weren't. She learned the ranch the way she learned most things, by doing. The cows were milked twice a day, morning and before supper, which she had known before she arrived, and which she was relieved to find he had also known, even if the previous months had made the schedule irregular. She set it straight on the first morning and kept it straight after that. The cows were better for it within 2 days. She could tell because they stood easier, came to the stall without the tension they'd had the first time. She said one morning while her hands were at work, "You had someone else doing this before," he said, from the doorway. "Yes," she said. "He left in the fall," he said. "September." She said, "Before the roof." He said, "Yes." She didn't ask why the man left. People left. Sometimes it was the land, and sometimes it was the pay, and sometimes it was something else, something that lived inside a property like a smell you stopped noticing once you'd been there long enough. She was not there long enough yet. The 40 head turned out to be 37, which she discovered by counting them herself on the 3rd day. She didn't make a point of it. She just noted it in the small book she kept in her coat pocket. A habit from before, from the years she didn't talk about and didn't intend to start talking about now. The man had a neighbor, a rancher named Hogue, who came by the 2nd week with a load of fence posts that had apparently been promised in September and not delivered until now. Hogue was wide-shouldered and cheerful in the noisy way of men who had decided long ago that cheerfulness was the best policy. He looked at her with frank curiosity that he made no effort to conceal. He said, "So you're the one?" She said, "I suppose I am." He said, "How are you finding it?" She said, "I've found worse." He laughed at that, which she had not expected but didn't object to. He unloaded the posts and drank coffee in the kitchen and talked about the winter coming and the price of cattle and a dispute he was having with someone called Meade about a water right. She listened. She refilled his cup when it was empty. When he left, he shook her hand, which she appreciated more than if he had said something nice about her. She said to the man after, "Meade. That a name I'll hear again," he said. "Probably," she said. "What's the nature of it?" he told her. A creek that crossed 2 properties, an old claim, a drier summer than usual. She listened and asked 2 questions and understood the situation well enough to know it wasn't urgent, but would become urgent if it wasn't watched. She wrote Meade in her book, underlined it. The first hard thing came at the end of that month in the form of weather. 3 days of wind, and then 2 of cold that had no wind in it at all, which was somehow worse. The cattle moved to the low shelter behind the barn and she let them, and added an extra feed rather than argue with their instincts. The man was in and out, hauling, fixing, doing the work of a man who had remembered how to work. Not completely, not with the ease of someone who had never stopped, but trying. She watched that too. The trying. She had seen men after loss before. Her father after her mother, her uncle after the farm. There was a particular quality to it, a kind of disconnection from the body, as if the hands and the legs were still operating, but the person behind them had stepped back several feet. She recognized it in him and did not remark on it and did not treat him gently because of it, because in her experience, gentleness was not what such men needed most. What they needed was something that kept moving, something that did not stop to ask how they were. She kept moving. On the 2nd night of the cold, the stovepipe in the kitchen separated at the joint and filled the room with smoke before she caught it. She dealt with it in the dark, with a rag around her hand and some language she didn't use in company, and by the time he came downstairs, the joint was seated, and the damper was right and the smoke was clearing. He stood in the doorway and looked at her, and she looked back. He said, "You should have woken me," she said. "It's handled," he said. "Still," she said, "go back to sleep." He didn't, but he did sit at the table and not get in the way, which was the next best thing. There was a town woman named Phyllis who ran the dry goods and who asked questions the way other people made conversation. Constantly, without particular malice, as a form of existing in space. She asked where the woman had come from and what she'd done before, and whether they were properly married or just keeping arrangement, and the woman answered the first 2 and left the 3rd unanswered, which Phyllis seemed to decide was answer enough. Phyllis said he was a different man before. The woman said most people are something before. Phyllis said she died in April, his wife. The woman said, I know. She hadn't known specifically, not the month. But she had known the shape of it, the stone outside the fence, the office room that nobody else used, the way he stood in the doorway of certain rooms and didn't come fully in. She said, thank you for telling me. She meant it. The root cellar turned out to be better stocked than she'd expected. Whoever had built it had known what they were doing. It was deep and dry and kept a steady temperature that she confirmed by going down twice a day in those first weeks. There were jars that were good and jars that had turned, and she sorted them carefully. Because sorting carefully was the difference between eating well and eating badly. And eating badly was the difference between managing a Montana winter and not managing it at all. She made a list of what was needed before February. She showed it to him. He looked at it for a while. He said, this is more than I'd usually put by. She said, what you'd usually put by was for one person. That and the herd needs better than it's been getting. The hay won't last to March at the current rate. He said, March is only, she said, 11 weeks from now. He recalculated quietly. She watched his face and did not remark on what she saw there, which was the expression of a man who has not been tracking time and has just understood that time has been tracking him. He said, right. She said, I can go to town Thursday if you'll give me the wagon, he said. I'll go with you, she said. You don't need to, he said. I know. He went anyway. They didn't talk much on the road, but the silence was a different kind than the one on the first trip. Less like two strangers. More like two people who had gotten used to the shape of each other. The neighbor Hoag had a daughter, Mira, who was 10 and who showed up one Saturday with a jar of preserved apricots and no discernible reason for being there. Except the reason that 10-year-olds have for going places, which is curiosity unencumbered by any social consideration. Mira sat at the kitchen table and asked 27 questions in 40 minutes, which the woman answered honestly when she could and deflected when she couldn't. Mira said, do you like it here? She said. I'm getting there, Mira said. Papa says you're not afraid of much, she said. Your papa's generous. Mira said, are you afraid of anything? She said after a pause. I'm afraid of not seeing things clearly, of missing what's right in front of me. Mira thought about that. Mira said, that seems like a useful thing to be afraid of. She said, I think so too. When Mara left, she stood at the window and watched her walk across the field, small and unhurried, and felt something in the chest that she hadn't expected, which was a kind of longing that was not quite loneliness, but was in the same general neighborhood. She turned back to the stove. The calving started in February, which she had prepared for, and he had prepared for less well than she would have liked, but better than he had the year before, which was something. She had asked him in January, specifically and without softening it. Last calving season, how many did you lose? He had told her. She had said, that won't happen this time. He had said, you can't promise that. She had said, I'm not promising it. She wasn't certain. She had a reasonable confidence in her preparations and her experience and the improved condition of the herd and the repaired fence and the covered shelter she'd had him build in December. Confidence was not certainty, but certainty was not available, and confidence was what the work required. The first calf came on a Thursday morning, easy, no trouble. The second was a night delivery, harder, and she was there for it, in the cold and the dark and the mess of it, and it came out right and stood upright, and she felt the particular satisfaction of that, the feeling of something beginning. He was there too. He'd come out after midnight without being asked, when he must have heard her moving. He didn't speak. He just did what needed doing, and she let him, and afterwards they stood in the barn while the calf found its feet, not saying anything, in the way of people who are sharing something that does not require words. She looked at him then, in the lamplight, and saw what she should have seen sooner, which was that he had stopped leaning quite so much. That the posture, the bad posture she'd noticed at the stage stop, had been grief. Grief had a way of bending a person. So did its leaving. She didn't say any of that. She said, get some sleep before morning milking. He said, yes, ma'am. It was the first time he'd said that. She noted it without making anything of it and walked back to the house through the cold. By April, the pass had been open for 3 weeks, and she had not thought about leaving, which she noticed around the middle of the month, The way you noticed the absence of a sound you'd stopped hearing, suddenly and with some consideration. She had thought, back in October, that she would assess the situation in spring. That was the arrangement she'd made with herself, quietly, in the way she made most arrangements. Come, stay through the worst of it, see what you see. The spring would tell her. The spring was telling her things. The kitchen garden was hers now. She had turned it herself in March, when the ground was still hard at depth, and planted what she knew would take and a few things she was curious about. The root cellar was low but not bare, and she had plans for filling it again by autumn. The herd had come through Calving with a loss of one, which was one she'd anticipated and had still minded, but minding and failing were different things. Phyllis told her, the second week of April, that people in town had stopped asking about the arrangement. The woman said, "What made them stop?" Phyllis said, "They figured it out." The woman didn't ask what they had figured out. She bought a packet of sweet pea seeds and a new paring knife and drove home. The man was mending fence when she got back. She could see him from the top of the rise, moving along the north line, unhurried, the way he had not moved in January. She watched him for a moment before she drove the wagon down. She unloaded the supplies and put things away, and then went out to the garden and stood in it a while, feeling the ground under her boots. The sweet peas would go on the south end, against the fence. They didn't need much, just something to climb. He came in for supper and she served what she'd made, and they ate with the window open to the evening air, which was finally barely soft enough to want. He said, "You've got mud on your sleeve." She said, "I know," he said. She said, "Sweet peas," he said. "You won't see them till July." She said, "I know." He set down his fork and looked at her, and she looked back, and the question that had been sitting between them since November, the real question, the one underneath all the practical ones, was not exactly asked and was not exactly answered, but it was present in the room in a way it had not been before. He said finally, "I didn't write a very good letter," she said. "No." He said, "I wasn't sure what to say, about what this was, what it might be." She said, "You said what you needed to say." He said, "Did I say enough?" She looked at the window. The light was going off the ridge the way it went in April, slow and then all at once. She said, "You said you needed someone steady." "I'm steady," he said. "I know that now," she said. "That's how it works." Mira came by in June with her father, who had finally resolved the water dispute with Meade through a handshake deal and 2 fence posts, and was in the mood to celebrate quietly, which was his way. He brought a ham, and Mira brought wildflowers in a tin cup, and they sat on the porch in the evening while the light lasted. Hogue said, "Place looks different than last fall." The man said, "A lot of things do." Hogue said it to the woman, specifically. "You've done good work here," she said. "We've done good work." Hogue looked between them. He didn't say anything more about it. He refilled his cup and asked about the water table, and they talked about the summer ahead, the dry spell that was likely coming, the price of calves in September. Practical things, real things, the kind of conversation that meant you were in a place, not just passing through it. After they left, she and the man stood on the porch in the last of the light. The garden was dark, the barn was quiet. The 40 head, 39 now with the spring calves, were settled somewhere in the pasture below the tree line. He said, "Hogue's right, it looks different." She said, "Most things do given time." He said, "How much time did you give it before you decided?" She said, "Decided what?" He said, "That you'd stay." She looked out at the ridge, the dark edge of it, the way it held the last color longer than the sky did. She said, "I planted sweet peas." He said, "Yes," she said, "that's not something you do if you're leaving." He was quiet. Then he said, "No, I suppose it isn't." The porch boards settled. Somewhere down in the pasture, one of the cows shifted and went still. The night came on in the way Montana nights come on in June, slowly, as if it has all the time in the world, as if there's no reason to hurry anything. She went inside to bank the fire, and he followed a few minutes later, and neither of them made a point of it. The ranch was not what it had been. It was not the jewel of anything, not yet. But it was tended, it was looked after. It was a place where things that had been broken were being repaired. Not all at once, but one fence post and one fair season and one early morning milking at a time. That was enough. That was the thing she had understood. Somewhere between October and April, between the first cold ride up from the stage stop and the sweet peas going into the ground. That it was enough,